The thought of finally going on this trip had been weighing on me all week. It's not that I didn't want to go, I just couldn't help but think how awkward it would be. We used to be really close, all of us, but a couple of years ago, naturally after school, we grew apart. Well, at least I did anyway. Most of them stayed pretty close together. That's why, when they asked me to go with them, I didn't really get it. We'd spent so much time apart, it was without a doubt that my being there would make it not just uneasy for me, but for them too. Anyway, having spent so much time at work recently, I thought maybe the break would be good for me. And who knows, maybe it would be just like the old days. We met at the trailhead on a cool Saturday morning. The sun hadn't fully broken through the clouds, casting a grayish hue over the forest. There they were, already chatting and laughing like no time had passed. I put on a smile and joined them, though deep down that familiar pit of discomfort sat in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the outsider. The hike started off fine. The awkwardness I feared wasn't there, at least not at first. The trail was beautiful, the trees towering above us like ancient sentinels. The more we walked, the more it seemed like we were slipping back into old routines. The conversation started flowing and it felt just like it used to. But the silences came. Uncomfortable pauses in the conversation. Moments where no one seemed to know what to say, and it hung in the air, awkward and heavy. I would try to jump in with a story or comment, but it didn't quite land the way I wanted it to. Instead of laughter or a response, the others would just nod, and then the silence would creep back in. I noticed something else too. Their eye contact with each other. The way they would glance at each other during those silences, like they were having some unspoken conversation without me. It felt deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, we hadn't hung out in years. Of course, it would take some time to get comfortable again, but still it nagged at me. The feeling that there was something more going on, that maybe I wasn't really welcome here. After a while, we veered off the main trail, taking a narrow, less traveled path that snaked deeper into the woods. We wanted to get away from the more popular areas, maybe even do some wild camping later, off the beaten path. That was when I first noticed him. There was someone behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. Could have been another hiker enjoying the day. I glanced back casually. Just a figure, maybe 50 or 60 feet back, walking at the same pace. No big deal, right? But every time I turned to look, he was still there. Always the same distance behind us, never getting closer, never falling further back. Just there, following. I didn't say anything at first. I thought maybe I was being paranoid. But after another hour of hiking, when I glanced back again and saw him still there, unease started to creep in. I mentioned it to the group, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, you guys notice that guy back there?" I said, nodding over my shoulder. They all looked, but no one seemed particularly concerned. "Yeah, probably just another hiker," one of them said. "This trail connects to a few other routes. He'll probably turn off soon." I nodded, trying to convince myself they were right, but something about the way the figure just stayed back there, matching our pace. It wasn't sitting right with me. And when I brought it up, I noticed those glances again. They looked at each other, exchanged these quick, unreadable looks, like they knew something I didn't. And that silence followed, just a bit too long. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun was starting to set. The light filtering through the trees was dim and fading fast, casting long shadows on the ground. We set up our tents in a rough circle and built a small fire in the middle. It felt good to finally sit down and relax after the long hike, though my nerves were still a little on edge. We cooked dinner over the fire, sharing stories, but as the evening wore on, I noticed the awkwardness creeping back in. Every now and then, the conversations would die down again, and those looks would pass between them, the ones I kept catching. But I forced myself to ignore it, focusing instead on the warmth of the fire, the food, and trying to enjoy the moment. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The air had gotten colder, and the fire was starting to dwindle. We all retreated to our tents, zipping up against the cool air. I lay there for a while, staring up at the fabric ceiling of my tent, listening to the rustling of the trees. The forest seemed almost unnervingly quiet. I don't know how long I lay there trying to force myself to sleep. The wind outside made the trees rustle, and every so often there'd be a crack or snap somewhere in the woods. Normal sounds, I told myself. The forest at night is full of little noises, animals, branches falling, nothing unusual. But the unease in my stomach hadn't left me since that figure had been following us. Then I heard it, a sharp thud against the side of my tent. My body tensed up immediately. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to snap me fully awake. I sat up, listening carefully. A few seconds passed, and there was another, louder this time. It felt too heavy to be just a pine cone or a falling branch. Someone had thrown something. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out. The fire was mostly embers now, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. I scanned the area with my flashlight, expecting to see someone crouched in the shadows, maybe one of the guys trying to mess with me. But there was no one. Just the other tents, all zipped up, no movement. It was eerily still. I thought about calling out, but I hesitated. If it was one of them trying to get a rise out of me, I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing it worked. Instead, I zipped my tent back up and lay back down, trying to act like nothing had happened. Just ignore it, I thought. Maybe they'll get bored and stop. I'd never really been an easy sleeper, so lying down and staring at the roof of the tent for hours didn't feel too unfamiliar. I was in that state of sleep where you're just beginning to fall, but you're still awake enough, conscious, and aware of your surroundings. I couldn't help but hear these noises. It sounded like the woods themselves were moaning, screaming in pain. I brushed it off as just normal noises you only really hear when you're concentrating on them. But something was off. It started sounding like someone was outside there, the creaks and moans of the trees turning into what sounded like sharp, purposeful footsteps just outside my tent, mere inches away from where my head was laying. I couldn't just brush this off like it was nothing. My heart began to race as the footsteps grew louder and louder as they drew closer. But just as I built the courage to confront whatever or whoever was out there, they began to fade away into the night just as quickly as they appeared. And then nothing but silence followed, so quiet the only sound I could hear was my own short, shallow breaths of fear. I wanted to go check it out so I could sleep easy, knowing it was nothing, but something told me not to. Was I just being paranoid? It was probably just one of my mates going to the toilet. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, and I was just overthinking again. I sat there for a while uneasy, almost hoping to hear the sounds again just for clarification that I wasn't going insane. But for as long as I could stay awake, they never came back, and eventually the tiredness crept in. Before I knew it, I was fast asleep, completely vulnerable, with nothing but a thin layer of fabric between me and whatever was out there. Suddenly, a firm, tight grip grabbed onto my shoulder, shaking me awake. Tired and startled, I jumped up in a panic, only for Jake to quickly put his clammy hand over my face, sealing my mouth shut. I looked into his eyes in fear, only to get the same back. He looked even more startled and uneasy than I did, a look I could never forget. I instantly knew something was wrong. "Shh, don't make a sound," he whispered in a firm, tense tone. "We need to go," he said. Confused, I sat up, trying to make sense of what was going on. At first, I couldn't put together what I was looking at. It looked like the campsite had been ransacked, turned upside down in a frantic panic. But when I looked closer, I saw what I can only describe as stick-like wooden figures hanging from the trees above us. Satanic, devilish-like symbols carved into the floor of our campsite and onto the trees that surrounded us for as far as I could see through the night sky. I could see the soulless shadows of my friends frantically gathering their stuff in a panic, looking just as lost and confused as I was. I grabbed my rucksack and torch and darted out of my tent as fast as I could. My sudden movement sparked the rest of my friends into a full-on sprint, running up the same narrow trail we came in on, leaving all our stuff behind. The branches clawed at us as we ran, as if they were reaching out, trying to grab hold of us, the shadows warping and twisting, making it impossible to tell what was real and what was in my head. My heart pounded in my chest, the thudding steps sounding louder and louder as we stampeded through the woods. I could almost feel something behind me, catching up near inches away, but I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I knew we were not alone anymore. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. Panic set in deeper with every step. My legs began to burn from the sprinting. I could feel my lungs begging for air. I needed to stop, but the adrenaline like shivers wouldn't let me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't keep going, there it was, the car, parked right where we left it. I wanted to think that was it. We were safe, but I knew it wasn't over just yet. We scrambled to throw ourselves into the car, the wheels already skidding in the mud before we even had a chance to slam the doors shut. I risked one last glance back toward the forest, and there, just at the edge of the trees, barely visible, was a figure, standing still, watching as we narrowly escaped their reach. I still can't shake what happened that night. I haven't spoken to or heard from any of the others since then. I still can't quite work it out. Was it all just a sick, twisted prank they had planned from the start? Or was someone, or something, really out there with us that night?